We're going to talk about how power is distributed in the world. And this would be a basic sort of lesson that you would see in any international relations course, and it might be in the first unit or the first couple of chapters. So, first of all, let's pretend this is the world. Now, for this lesson, we're going to say the world is the system. But it doesn't necessarily have to be the world, and we're going to go into that a little bit later. It could be a part of the world, maybe a continent, or even a part of a continent where these different powers are struggling. So it's not necessarily the whole world, and it depends on the time in history we're talking about. But probably the most classic example of how power is distributed is called bipolar. Now, if you think of a battery, one side is positive and one side is negative. And those are the poles, or if you think of the North or the South Pole. So in a bipolar world, you really have these two superpowers, are very powerful countries. And there might just be a few neutral powers in the middle. And this is another superpower up here. So as you can see, this is called bipolar because there's really only two powers that matter in the world. And all of these other countries have to then make alliances or work with one of these two countries. So for instance, up here, now we have to think of a time period or an historical example of bipolarity in international relations. And the best example might be from around, let's just say 45, the end of World War II, some people say 47, up until 1991. This is when the Soviet Union collapsed. So during this time frame, it was the Cold War. And the two major powers were the United States and NATO as its allies. And down here, it would be the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact countries. Now, over time, some cracks did appear in some of these alliance systems, which we'll kind of go over later in the class. Okay, so that's bipolarity. Now, multipolar would be where there's, let's just say, let's say 5 or 6 great powers in this system. I'll just call these countries A through F. And all of these are great powers. Nothing's a superpower. And the system here is the world, but yet again, the system could be something like, say, Europe, maybe just Europe before World War I, so before 1914. And there's a good example of how the system could just be specific places. So the system could be China, it could be Southeast Asia, Africa, maybe Latin America. So in this system, there were many countries that were about roughly equivalent in terms of their power. And when we talked about power, remember that could be the military, it could be economic power, or a combination. And no one power can really take over any of the other powers. And this leads to another term we need to know. And this really works well in a great power sort of system or a multipolar system. It's called balance of power. So in this multipolar system, balance of power is the idea that these countries all coexist. No country wants to see any other country get too much power. So let's say A starts getting too powerful. It's building its military, and it might dominate countries around it. What are these other countries going to do? They want to maintain the balance of power. They don't want A to get too powerful. So one thing they could do is build their own military or improve their own military. They could also improve their economy. So these are things they can do by themselves without a different country. A second thing they could do would be build alliances. Maybe B and D would get together and sign a treaty. And normally in a multipolar system, you have many alliances. Well, if B and D sign a treaty, maybe A and C will sign a treaty, and then F and E will sign a treaty. And these treaty systems can often be very complex, which we're going to go into that later. So yet again, multipolar is just when you have many different powers in the system, and they often try to maintain a balance of power. And there's different ways they can do that. These options here are called balancing, the methods of balancing. So these options are internal balancing, because they're things the country can do by itself. And this method is called external balancing. And of course, a balance of power could be maintained in other systems too. This is just really the best example. Okay, some people argued after 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, that really just left the United States as the sole superpower. And then there's some mid-level states. They're called second-tier powers. And then there's going to be parts of the world that are just dubbed zones of chaos. They're not very powerful, but bad things can still happen. The best example of this may be just recently, where you have the US and you have maybe China or Russia or a few other powers in here. And then zones of chaos would be areas like Syria, where ISIS, which is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, a terrorist group, was trying to dominate. So then you could sort of go around the world and say, well, what are some areas that are zones of chaos in this theory? But in the stratified theory, there's only one superpower. Now, by the way, I want to mention these are all just theories. Sometimes theories are good, but real life doesn't align 100% with the theory, and then you have to come up with a new theory. So there are arguments to be made that the world was not stratified after 1991. Okay, the last one we're going to look at is called unipolar, and that's just like it sounds. In this idea, there's just one huge superpower. And after 1991, people argue that is the US, of course, and it just dominates the world and can sort of maintain peace, but also its own economic dominance. And this is what many people thought the world was going to be like from 1991, but then once we got into the late 1990s, and of course the 2000s, we saw the rise of terrorism. And so we also saw China trying to exert its influence and power, and other countries trying to exert power. And so one big idea is that in any system, it's not going to remain stable. It's always going to change over time, and countries are always going to try to maximize and maintain their power. So those are the four basic examples that I would make you know in class. And we're going to do a little project on these four basic examples. We're going to try to use historical examples, and you're going to have to do a little bit of research to then find historical examples and maybe some countries from history that fill these different criteria. All right, thank you.